So welcome everybody, good afternoon. My name is Charles Hui and I am the MC for today's Caring Together seminar. Welcome to everyone here, face to face, and to those joining us on live stream. Now for those who are here, please take the time to check in, if we go to the next slide, using the QR code, which will appear soon. So this is more for those who are here. To check in. That's good. Is my head too big in the way? That's good. Don't psych me out, okay? All right. So anyway, thank you for joining us in this highly important, but often a fairly hushed topic of understanding and managing internet porn use, especially in Christian settings as well. You know, when I asked my life group to pray about this seminar and for me to MC this seminar, I was met with, a period of silence, followed by, oh, that's nice. And then followed by, Charles, why did they choose you? And I was of the impression that they were implying that either I have no shame or that I'm just trying to get help. Nevertheless, IP is everywhere, anywhere, and at any time, and does not discriminate. So it is commendable that we are all here today to learn how we can manage it. So if we go to the next slide, slide 3. There are 3 segments to our seminar today. First, we have Associate Professor Jee Hyun Kim speaking on the neurobiological impact of porn use, followed by Dr. Grant Bickerton, who will be presenting on the ABCs of habitual IP use. Then finally, we will have roughly about 20 minutes on Q&A. Please send all questions to the number as shown, and we'll try and go through them, depending on time. So a little bit background of our speakers. Dr. Grant Bickerton is a member of the Australian Psychological Society, has a Master's of Counselling Psychology and a PhD in Psychology. He's a counselling psychologist with 15 years of missionary experience in Australia and overseas. He conducts psychological assessments for missionary candidates, psychological debriefing for returning missionaries, and personal counselling therapy. His research expertise concerns the psychological and spiritual variables that reduce work stress and promote well-being among Christian missionaries. So he's a nice man to meet. He'll make you happy. Associate Professor Jee Hyun Kim is a behavioural neuroscientist with an undergraduate honours and a PhD in psychology. She's a principal research fellow and the head of molecular psychiatry laboratory at the Deakin University School of Medicine. She is a multiple award recipient and her work focuses on emotional learning and memory during childhood and adolescence. So without further delay, let us start the session with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, may your name be glorified. Please speak through Grant and Jee so that understanding and insights be given to those who are listening and that we may apply them in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we have Associate Professor Dr. Jee. There's too many titles you've got.
It's fine. Should I take this? Yeah. Thank you so much for the generous introduction. I've actually never tried to use the clicker in our auditorium. Is that working? Next slide. Oh. There we go. Next slide. Oh. Am I supposed to... Okay, can I just see? Because I want to make sure it works for you, Grant. Oh, okay. Oh. Am I pressing the right button? Sorry. Just want to sort it out for you. Oh, okay. It was off. There we go. So God made us to naturally like a lot of things, like food, for example, or food with friends. Of course, Korean barbecue is the ultimate food. I'm Korean, so I'm not biased. And that actually helped us to survive, because if we didn't like eating, then we would starve to death. And also actually helping and showing kindness and giving is naturally rewarding. A lot of studies have shown that actually giving in the long run guarantees more happiness than taking. Even grooming has been shown to actually increase endorphin and happiness chemicals. And of course, relationships can give us a lot of joy. So getting straight in, when there's a brain region called the ventral tegmental area that releases dopamine into the rest of the brain. It goes into many different regions, but one of the areas that it goes into the most is what we call the frontal cortex or frontal lobe. And that's actually the brain region that makes us quite human compared to the other animals. I think we are all animals, but that makes what makes us human has a lot to do with being able to help. You know, when you want to take food from other people, you actually give food. Or when you want to go and have sex with everything, like animals do, you actually don't. And those sort of behaviors, being able to control and inhibit or make decisions for the greater good is actually what makes us very human compared to other animals. And that dopamine goes a lot to controlling that brain region called the frontal lobe. And people sort of really misunderstand that we get a lot of dopamine when we are happy or when we achieve something. So it is true that when we have this naturally rewarding experience that the brain produces dopamine, and that dopamine actually binds to a lot of receptors, especially the dopamine receptors, and they can do opposite things depending on the brain region. But to simply put, they can then strengthen the memory of that rewarding experience, and it allows more attention and more motivation to be given for future similar experiences when your memory is triggered of that experience. But in the long run, it turns out that excess dopamine, if you have too much of it, it can actually reduce your overall tone that the brain naturally produces. And I'll explain that more in detail later. But there is a solution. God has made us so amazingly so that as long as we sort of stick to natural rewards, the excess dopamine is used up so that you don't reduce your basal dopamine tone overall. And that is actually hard work. So any effort that you put into anything, whether it's thinking really hard or whether it's physical, it could be running, but it could just be like painting the wall or cleaning, actually uses up this dopamine. So it actually uses up so much dopamine, the brain thinks, oh, okay, my balance is a bit disturbed, so I'm going to make more dopamine in the future. So the more effort we put into anything actually increases your basal dopamine level. And this is very simple neurobiology of how rewarding experiences make us repeat that action, but can reward us in the end by producing more dopamine overall just in natural life without any external stimulus. So there is a quote by Thomas Edison. I mean, Edison is not the bestest of person, or maybe not even scientist, but he was very good with quotes, so I had to use this one. So he said, one of the quotes he said is, opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. And I repeat this quote a lot to my potential PhD students or master's students because they're like, oh, I want to be like you. I want to go give talks. I want to be a professor. I want to, discover the truth of life. But as soon as they realize that, sometimes you have to work really hard. Well, we do developmental work. That means that you don't get weekends sometimes. It's like they're suddenly not keen. It's like, how do I skip over doing all the experiments in the lab, go straight to where you are? And I'm like, well, that's not how this works. But if you love it enough, if you prioritize it enough, you work hard for it. And that's how our brain is wired. The more important something is, it expects you to work for it so that it can provide more substrate or dopamine, so you can work hard, you can be more rewarded in the future. So to describe this, let's say you have this base dopamine level, and actually that level changes throughout life, especially in adolescence. The brain produces a lot more dopamine, but we have less receptors. So God really made us in a very amazing way. So let's say that's dopamine at baseline. You see a reward-related cue. Let's say you see your wife or your husband or your friend. That's a cue. That's cue for a rewarding experience. You actually, so your dopamine starts to rise. So I guess public doesn't realize that dopamine doesn't only get produced when good things happen. Actually, dopamine is produced when it's triggered by a memory, by some stimulus that wants you to work hard. So typically, if I see my husband, what I would want to do is make him happy. So that's when I start to make an effort, And what happens is then the dopamine starts to reduce in your body, in your brain. And then you receive your reward. Typically, with natural rewards, the rise in dopamine and the use of dopamine sort of coincides so that reward is actually happening when your dopamine levels are quite low. And then so you actually end up with a higher dopamine level for the next cue, to simply put. So what that means is that's where you started, and with this sort of cycle of rewarding experience and putting in effort, you end up with more dopamine at the end. And that means that because dopamine is so important for things like motivation, more memory, more attention, you are more ready for the next rewarding experience to put in that hard work. So this is why that happens. I'm actually going to... So I found this really cute picture, and then I changed the thing for it. Anyway, some of it. So if you get a lot of dopamine, did that change? What happens is that... Oh, okay. So that's like, let's say, how you started, and then you get more dopamine. The brain has this amazing way to balance it out. They actually don't like too much dopamine because it's too exciting. It actually literally kills the cell. So what they do is that they create more transporters so that it can actually remove that dopamine and store it in that cell. And that's how you can end up with, if you have too much dopamine that you don't use, you might end up with less dopamine overall because the brain doesn't want to be overstimulated. And this is partly why like hard drugs and stuff, it can cause tolerance and so on and so on. So, but over time, if you have too many dopamine transporters, then you actually don't have dopamine at all left that is stored for future use. So when I study the brain, we know so little that what I've just shown you is a very short summary of like 50 years of work that millions of scientists have worked towards to finally understand how addiction can occur. And it has a lot to do with how the body has a way to balance itself out. It's like, I don't like washing my hair, so I stopped washing my hair, but the hair was so greasy because I used to wash it every day, and the hair got so greasy, but I just like toughed it out. I try to wash it every 2 days, and then every 3 days. Julie told me the same thing. She says she only washes it once or twice a week, like me. But anyway, finally leveled it out so that my scalp wasn't producing that much oil anymore. So God has made us so wonderfully so that we can have this balance that is going constantly. So I agree with David. I'll just read it. Praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. So addiction. We have these natural rewards, but just like, valuing people more than God, addiction is simply valuing whatever you are craving. That's what we call a crack pipe or ice pipe. They're smoking crystals of methamphetamine, and that's what I study mostly in the lab. It's that you prioritize that way more than the natural rewards. And this is because, the dopamine, when it's released, whatever you're experiencing at the time, it tends to strengthen that memory. That's why I like to define many of the mental disorders as fundamentally a memory disorder. It's how your body and brain remembers things and then wants to reproduce that experience. So alcohol, nicotine, heroin, cannabis artificially cause excess dopamine, and it ultimately reduces basal dopamine because you didn't have to work too hard to get the hit. But similarly, more and more literature is showing neurobiologically pornography, masturbation, gambling, phone use, even shopping causes excess dopamine because hard work was not required to get that hit of dopamine. So normally, let's say, natural reward, you have this curve and how dopamine basal levels may change. What happens with these less natural rewards that might not require hard work is that you have a cue. So you might look at porn, and then your dopamine starts to increase, and you decide to reward yourself with an orgasm, but there was no hard work. So because the brain cannot sustain that high level of dopamine, and it can be toxic for the brain, you end up with a lower dopamine level in the brain. And this actually happens with methamphetamine. This has been mostly shown with animals. We actually don't have a very good way to measure tonic dopamine levels. We can only measure phasic, what we call phasic, acute dopamine levels, but our lab is actually working with a group in Mayo Clinic looking at ways to measure tonic dopamine in humans by translating technology from rats to humans. But this is basically fundamentally how addictive disorders tend to work. It actually makes you gives you ultimately reduced overall motivation, attention, and memory. And that is basically the symptoms of depression. That's why addiction and depression go so hand in hand. So I didn't want to cause a cue, so it's a word. Just like hard drugs, porn and masturbation, if you are addicted to it or if you do it regularly, that tend to replace all the dopamine, all the resources may be spent on strengthening that reinforcing relationship, that rewarding relationship between cue and masturbation, that everything else, all the normal rewards or natural rewards that make us happy are not valuable anymore. And you don't have the brain neurotransmitters to actually motivate yourself to work towards other things, because eating food with friends or being nice to other people, grooming yourself and having relationship all require effort. But you don't have the dopamine levels if you are focusing on that one thing that you really crave. But you can recover. So the brain is amazingly made. So you are at this state where you don't have much dopamine, there's too many dopamine transporter, and there's just not much dopamine in or outside the cell. But over time, if there's not enough dopamine, we actually start to reduce these new dopamine transporters that take away dopamine back into the cell. So you actually have more dopamine that appears in your cell, because it's like, there's not dopamine around. And then you actually can have natural dopamine in the synapse restored. So the brain is able to forget. The brain is able to reverse these changes. And initially, when I first started studying psychology in the early 2000s, it was believed that, once you're born, a lot of processes that make your brain plastic and change actually stops, but now we know that's not true at all. More and more research suggests that till the day you die, your brain is generating new cells. The brain is capable of change. And relapse is actually, I just define it as you forget to forget. So you might recover from whatever you may be addicted to, but you can relapse. But recovery is not a straight line. It's actually you relapse, but you recover, relapse and recover until the time or the duration between relapse is longer and longer and longer. And in this way, I do support the Alcoholics Anonymous, adage of, I'm recovering alcoholic. I've been recovering for 25 years. And that's how we perceive most of addictions. But what I want to say is that relapse does not make you weak. And as Christians, we try not to sin and we fail all the time. But I think God sees our heart when we don't give up. You gotta not give up. I think you need to focus on that. Even though relapse time, maybe you relapse and it takes a month to recover again, you just don't give up. And it does not make you weak. It's not a failure. It's just how you recover. And I like to show that there's so much stigma with addiction, whether it's hard drugs or whatever, at least what we call illicit substance use. We measure relapse rates, and it turns out, what is this? Percent who relapse. Oh yeah, the percent who relapse from drug addiction. So this is the biggest drug abuse research institute in the world, in the USA. And I don't know if you know, they have a huge opioid epidemic right now because of the prescriptive drugs, painkillers. But they've shown that when they tracked all these studies over many years, it turned out compared to hypertension or even asthma, relapse in drug addiction was less. But for some reason, when people relapse back into hypertension, back into asthma, people actually received a lot of sympathy. But when you relapse from depression, when you relapse from bipolar or relapse from addiction, they didn't receive such sympathy. And we need to really understand that brain diseases are basically physical body diseases too, and we need to be more sympathetic and help them with recovery. So I thought it was really appropriate. Of course, on your own, by yourself, you cannot do this. Or if you're supporting somebody, it's hard. But I think Jesus promises us that he is with us, that we are not alone ever. If we try to recover from sin or addiction or anything you may be struggling with. And I'm really glad that our church is able to support us as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jee. Well, thank you, Jee. That was very, very insightful. Yeah, great. Well, g'day everyone. My name's Grant, and I'm going to be following on from what Jee's been talking about. And you might have a handout here. This primarily actually relates to this section of our afternoon together. So I'm just going to be talking through actually just trying to understand and manage internet pornography use from a particular psychological perspective, a therapeutic psychological perspective. So internet pornography, or IP, they're kind of a synonymous thing, language that I'll be using this afternoon. So I want to look at it from a therapeutic perspective, because unless some of those factors are recognised, it can be difficult sometimes to make progress. Addressing problematic internet porn use is not simply a matter of willpower, but it's actually about understanding the mechanisms involved and then trying to build some habits that can enable us to function more effectively or in a more godly manner. Internet pornography today, or using porn today, is very different than what it was like 25 years ago. And the skyrocketing use of pornography today is because of the AAA engine effect, is what most people talk about in terms of internet pornography. That is, pornography today, it's accessible. It's everywhere on the internet. Some people say up to 30% of all internet traffic is related to internet pornography. It's anonymous because you can consume internet porn on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer in very secretive ways. And it's affordable. You can access a lot of it either free or at very low cost. And so what drives the rise in internet pornography use has been often attributed to this internet, the AAA engine. So it's a real issue, actually. One study done in 2017, out of actually 1,000 Victorians aged between 16 and 29, found that 85% of the males in that sample used internet pornography on a daily or weekly basis. 25% of all females out of that cohort of 1,000 people used on a weekly or daily basis as well. So it's a real issue, actually, and it's a real issue also for us in our Christian communities. So in some ways, it appears that religiosity is inversely correlated with internet pornography use. So it's not to say that it's exactly the same. In fact, religiosity has a positive effect on actually the rate of use and the endorsement of use of pornography. But here's the kicker. Levels of distress are much greater for people who are higher on the religiosity, if that makes sense. So there might not be as high amount of use, but when there is use, it's actually a lot more distressing for people's lives. But the use is actually pretty significant as well. A 2016 report from the Barna Group, they talked about how well over 50% of pastors and youth pastors report current or previous internet pornography use at a difficult level or a distressing level. And even people, 55% of current pastors were saying they feel that they're actually struggling to such a degree that they're living in constant fear of this being discovered in my life. So on balance, you could say that what research is there, it does suggest that the Christian population uses pornography yet less than the non-Christian population, but we're much more likely to have a greater degree of guilt and personal distress over the behaviour that dramatically affects our lives. There can be a tendency in religious people groups to have a cyclic use of pornography habits. You know, when we engage in something that conflicts with our cherished beliefs, it does generate shame and guilt. And that tends to lower our sense of self-worth, and it precipitates lower feelings of self and some even anxiety. Those feelings are associated with tendencies to isolate as well. That can then magnify my negative feelings and thoughts. But ironically, using porn provides an escape for those very feelings. Of course, it's only short term, and it leads to even more guilt and more shame and further distancing from God and others, but there's a downward spiral there. Because the worse I feel, the more distant I feel from God, the more attractive actually that quick hit of dopamine, the porn escape, becomes. And so I can spiral on down. So often there's a binge pattern for those of us who are religious people in terms of internet pornography use. There's a binge pattern. I'm trying to maintain really tight control, live up to my moral standards until the pressure reaches a crisis point where I can then slip. I can relapse, or I'll call it a slip. But sometimes when I feel like I've slipped, I think, well, what's the point? I've stuffed it now, and so I can binge away for a time. Now, that can be really even accentuated even more if I feel like my faith is a really big part of my identity. Maybe I'm a leader, or maybe I have a responsibility, or maybe I feel like my community sees me in a certain way. Sometimes when that's going on, there's additional pressure, feeling like I can't even disclose my internet pornography struggles with others for fear of what they might think. And then that can really lead to a very difficult splitting in ourselves. We can create a double self. I might have this controlled righteous persona, but I can also have a private world of acting out. And as that goes on, if that goes on, that can be very, very damaging over time. We can split ourselves apart in some ways in terms of our identity. So our stability of our identity becomes actually quite fractured. And then it can be difficult. I can start to think, well, who am I really? Am I Christian Grant or am I secret Grant? And I can start to lead different lives. So there's a number of issues to do with internet pornography. It's certainly not as highly prevalent, I would say, amongst Christians, but let me tell you, it is damaging. It really can be damaging for us. But what I really want to focus the most of our time on is actually considering a model for trying to understand what some of the processes that go on using IP in order for us to think about how can we intervene, how can we address it, and how can we help one another with that. And so that is, we want to talk about the ABCs of IP use. That's what we think about. So what do I mean by that? Well, ABCs, it's just a basic psychological model where A stands for the antecedents or the triggers for a craving or a desire to use or consume porn, where the B stands for beliefs that I might have or justifications that allow me to use, and then C stands for the consequences. So what happens after I use? How do I feel and how do I respond? So why this is important? Because all behaviour exists for a reason. I might start using porn for one reason, but let me tell you, all behaviour continues to exist for a reason. It's actually doing something for me. And so the first step, I would say, to recovery or to taking ground is actually to own up and actually identify, what is this doing for me? What is it doing for me? What's the purpose that it's serving? That's really important, because once that's understood, then I can actually engage in the challenge to try to figure out what could be a more healthy or a more godly or an alternative way to meet that need. Let me say that again. All behaviour exists for a reason. I might start using porn for whatever reason, however I got into it, but why do I keep using it? The goal of what I want to talk about is, once I can understand that, what is that doing for me? We need to think about what are more godly or more healthy ways that I can meet that legitimate need, but in a healthier way. First step is to actually understand, what is this doing? What is this doing for me? And then we want to think about, how can we therefore intervene at each of those points along that process? So, to help me kind of get into that, let me use a bit of an analogy that I use, and it's a brain analogy. I'm a bit nervous though, talking in front of Jee, I've got to tell you. But anyway, it's a brain analogy, and it actually helps me then get into this ABC type model. So like Jee was talking about, our brains are actually quite flexible and fluid, and actually when we start to have repeated behaviours or thoughts related to actions, neurons actually start to group together in pathways and become well-defined pathways when they're repeated over and over and over. Neural pathways start to get formed. Just kind of like when you want to go for a drive through the bush. You can have some strong neural pathways and weaker neural pathways. But when you start to go for a drive through the bush, actually, and there's no real pathway there, well, it takes quite a bit of time to make your way through, to make the connections, to start getting going a path. When you're coming back the other way, there might be a couple of tyre tracks and you go a little bit faster. Now, if you repeatedly go down that same track, as in repeat the behaviour, repeat the use of the behaviour, triggered, used, triggered, used, triggered, used. But if you keep on, if you like, driving down that same kind of track, actually the track gets stronger. And as it keeps on going, that pathway becomes thicker. And over time, maybe it actually gets sealed. And now actually it's faster, that pathway is faster and faster and faster. And sooner or later, it becomes like a superhighway, a 6-lane superhighway as we go along. Herein is the first important step in the struggle, I would say, to overcome the pornography issues. The less we fire up the pathway, the weaker the pathway will become over time. However, the reverse is also true. The more I keep firing it up, the more I use IP in response to these kinds of triggers, the more entrenched the pathway becomes, the more the learning gets reinforced. So like I said, what we were wanting to do here is we want to try to create healthier pathways. Healthier pathways. Or as Paul might say, take off the old self and put the new self on. This is about putting on a new self, renewed in the image of our Creator. Create healthier pathways. Overcoming internet pornography use is not simply concerned with only stopping the problem behaviour. It's about creating a more positive, healthier life in other spheres as well. So that positive patterns of living are created and they can actually become more and more entrenched. So let's use that analogy to consider the use of internet porn. Feel free at any time, if you've got a question, text it in. Make sure you're texting it in, all the text up there. So, the first port of call in the model is about triggers or antecedents that generate the urge to use. So these are the things that kind of get our mind thinking or create the craving or create the urge. I like to think about what are triggers. Triggers are like signposts in suburbia to the highway of internet pornography use. They're things that actually get my mind going. You know what? I could use porn. And it's like a signpost in suburbia that points me towards the eventual highway. And those signposts keep on going closer and closer to the highway until I get onto the on-ramp. And you know what it's like when you get on an on-ramp. You know, maybe the M1. Once you're on the on-ramp, it's really hard to get off, right? Triggers are like the signposts that will eventually lead you to the on-ramp to the actual highway of IP use. They're the things that lead to the variety of twists and turns that actually get me to using. That's why managing triggers is actually so important, because it's easier to avoid going on the highway when you're in suburbia than when you're on the on-ramp. So we need to actually intervene at the trigger level. So broadly speaking, there's two different types of triggers. We might talk about them as being external triggers or internal triggers. They're things in the environment, in terms of external triggers, that trigger my thoughts and feelings to urge to use or engage in the behaviour. And internal triggers might be internal states. So some specific examples of external triggers are up there. What are some classic external triggers? Time of day. Maybe it's early in the morning, often it's late at night, but there's times of the day which I kind of are just triggers for me to start urging or having an urge to use. Sometimes or often there'll be some type of explicit content, whether it's in social media, Facebook or Instagram. That'll be a trigger to start the journey towards the highway. Maybe something in the books or in a book or a magazine or on TV. They can be classic kind of triggers. Sometimes people are triggers. Other people, I can linger or leer in my thinking. Sometimes too, just specific locations get paired with an urge to use. And I've put down a very important one. Seminars on internet pornography use. Believe it or not, that's a key trigger. Because now we're talking about internet pornography. And that could just start my thinking process. So I just want to say that out loud to be honest. And so I would say we need to be careful over the next 24 hours. Be open about what's going on in terms of triggers or triggers to crave or use. So there's external triggers, and it's important to know your triggers so that you can respond to signposts in suburbia rather than before you get too far down towards the highway. So there's external triggers, but for many people, to be honest, it's the internal triggers that are much more potent antecedents to using. Emotional states, such as loneliness or anger, or just feeling really down about myself. Anxiety or stress, coping with stress. They're extremely common emotions that are triggering for problematic acting out of many different sorts, but including internet pornography. Because what does pornography do? It gives me an escape. It's a temporary, short-term escape, but it does give me that escape for a short amount of time to a place of calm, a safe state, where there are those soothing hormones released in the brain. But of course, it's only for a short amount of time. And then it all comes back, and comes back more. So, as we identify our triggers, what we need to do is we need to create alternative plans for dealing with each trigger in a healthier or more godly way. And like Jee said, that's going to involve work. It's not going to be that quick hit. But again, like Jee said, it's going to be better in the long run. A much more healthier, God-honouring way of living. So here's some examples of what I mean by managing both internal and external triggers in a healthier way. So engaging with others to talk out what's going on. Prayer support with others. Engaging in more enjoyable or constructive activities. Positive emotions are one of the greatest tools for stress reduction. engaging in things that generate positive emotions in a positive way. That will assist for sure. In terms of the external triggers, definitely avoidance to a degree, and where possible. So being aware of what's going to be dangerous situations. And maybe I need to avoid it, or maybe when I do encounter them, I just need to bring it out in the open very, very quickly, like I just did talking about attending a seminar, like I am today. Contacting supports early, and then practicing thought stopping or actually cognitive techniques to just be aware, bring into consciousness when my mind does start to wander, and how can I manage that there. So firstly, we want to think about triggers. That's really important. Know our triggers and have a bit of an idea of what can I do to intervene at that point. Because it's always easier to avoid getting on the highway when you're 3 blocks out. And so we need to discuss and think about triggers early. But just before we enter the highway, there will often be an on-ramp. And that's what I refer to as beliefs or distorted thinking that promotes and or justifies use just before I'm using. So training the way one thinks and managing thoughts is really important, because those thoughts, those beliefs, really they are the common on-ramp to the pornography highway. So triggers can initiate a number of different thoughts, but just before people use, commonly there's justifying beliefs and thoughts that tend to just immediately precede action. So here are some of the common thoughts that people have to bypass my cherished beliefs, my internal barriers that enable me to engage in pornography. I'll just have a look. That's all I'll do. I'll just have a quick look. I keep on wanting to say, hands, who's had that thought? I won't do that. But let's face it, that's a common thought. I'm not really hurting anyone. These things are already out there. It's not like I'm really hurting anyone. It's not like I'm having a real affair. I just use this for education. You know what? This is actually helping my spouse. It's taking the pressure off my spouse. I've got no other choice. I just can't handle it. I've got no other choice. I deserve it. You know what? I've been working so hard lately. I've been performing. I've been doing really well. In fact, you know what? I deserve this because I'm like 6 weeks without looking at internet pornography. I deserve this because I've been doing so well in my recovery. This is going to make me feel better. This will really make me feel better. This is the only way that I can cope with this feeling of loneliness or this feeling of that thing. I'm not trying to make a joke out of this, actually. I'm not trying to be funny. This is real. These are our real thoughts. Now, at one level, every one of them, I can have a bit of a justification. But at another level, I also know these are just justifications that part of my consciousness is seeking to overcome my other cherished convictions. So better thoughts lead to better actions. And so I would say it is imperative that we wake up at this point. We just need to be honest about what's going on here. Honest with ourselves is the first step, but also it's worthwhile being honest with other people as well. So one technique to be honest with myself and to also slow down the process, because when we're craving, to be honest, there will be a peak period of craving, but that peak period, whilst we feel like I just can't endure it, it doesn't last that long. It can be like 1/4 of an hour plus of peak craving. It comes like a wave. I experience it. I feel like I can't stop, but it can resolve over a period of time. So one technique might be to slow the process down, slow my thinking down by actually writing them out, and actually discussing or having some comebacks. Because let's face it, I'll be honest with you. When I write down these things, I feel embarrassed to myself. Because I know they're not true, but when they're in here, unnamed, they are powerful and true. So I sit down, I write them out. I don't know if you can read that, but there's some of the comebacks. I'm only looking, well, let me tell you, Grant, only looking is activating those neural pathways. Further, there is a raft of moral concerns that I have. I am not only looking. These are real people, many of whom have been or are being exploited, have been abused, who may have no real choice about being in this industry. There is a raft of issues here. I am not only looking. It's not like I'm having a real affair. Let me tell you, that rationalization is certainly not true for other people who I'm actually in a relationship with. I feel cheated when that's going on with my spouse, or if that's happening to my spouse. The most significant problem with this rationalization is that instead of building intimacy and that pairing with the person who's most important to me, I'm building it in isolation with myself and some image. It's not like I'm having a real affair. Maybe not. It takes the pressure off off a spouse. This is not growing and encouraging, progressing my real relationships. This is subverting them. I have got no other choice. You know what? There has probably been times in the past where I have been successful. There are many people actually who are probably committed to helping me here. I'm part of a community. I have made decisions to do difficult things in other areas of my life. I have no other choice. That's not true. It's hard, yes. But there's going to be a dopamine kick when I do something hard anyway. So hang in there. I deserve it. Grant, this is not a reward. This is not a reward. I can recall that sense of guilt and shame. I know it's going to come. Not only about myself, but when I'm actually in fellowship with other people as well. I know what this does to me. This is not a reward. I'm using it for education. Let me tell you, like nothing else, IP actually distorts healthy sexuality. Like nothing else, IP distorts healthy sexuality. It's artificial, it's staged, it has so many correlates with negative outcomes related to relationships, expectations about sexuality. It is horrendous. It increases inadequacy at the very minimum and can do a whole lot of things worse as well. So I need to call out these lies for what they are. They are lies. So it's important to understand these beliefs can be subtle and powerful. They're the on-ramp. They help me bypass my normal conscience and slip into a state which is kind of like that split brain kind of thing. I go into some autopilot. These are automatic thoughts. We need to call them out. But to be honest, when an urge is really strong, just sitting by myself with a pen and paper might not be strong enough. I do need to have a raft of activities or plans of what I can do to really help me there. And we might come to that a little bit later. Antecedents, know your triggers. Know what is this doing for you? What does porn do for me? How can I meet this need in a more healthy way? B, call out the lies and the beliefs. Call them out. We need to get them out of here, externalize them so I can see and go, bring my frontal lobe more into the room and say, come on, Grant. Or take action with others to help me do that as well. Speak that out. That could be helpful. But thirdly, there's the issue of consequences. So if a person has been trying to resist and then they have a slip, as I said, the tendency can be to go into a binge. I've blown it now. But I just want to encourage us, no, don't do that. That is just going to keep on building that highway more and more and more. A good thing actually for a slip is that it can help you to learn. because no one gets all the triggers out first. No one gets all the beliefs down right. Sometimes actually a slip or a near slip can be really, really helpful for learning and strengthening your changed behaviour. So see a slip as a potential positive to learn from. I'm not endorsing a slip, but I want to prevent the binge. So what can be helpful is to actually think about your highway and what was the actual twists and turns that led me up to using. Because there probably will be like 20 to 40 individual decisions or triggers that lead up to my using internet pornography. Kind of like the suburbs, and there's a whole lot of ways you can move until you get onto the highway. So let me give you an example of what I mean. We're starting up here, just near Wheelers Hill Secondary College. I might wake up late. Oh no, I'm already running late. I'm having a rush breakfast, I spill cereal on my shirt, I feel like an idiot. Already there's internal emotional states going on. Triggers. I argue with my partner when I'm going out the door is like the second step. I can choose which way to go maybe. Call it out, acknowledge it, or I can keep on going. I look at the petrol gauge, I need to pick up petrol, I drive into the petrol, I'm putting the petrol in, I walk in to pay, and there I see a magazine or something in the things. Bang. All of a sudden, the thought comes in my mind. Now, the next step is then I might have nagging thoughts about porn throughout the day because I've seen that magazine cover. It's in my mind now. Next step, the boss sees I'm somewhat distracted and gets on my case. What am I going to do then? Next step, then I start to feel annoyed at my boss. And resentment is rising, internal states again. Then the next step, I start to think maybe I could go online later tonight. The next step. The next step. Evening's not as good at home because of the argument I had when I left the house. Both of us feel tense. Not addressed. Next step. Later I ask my partner for sex, but she's not in the mood. Next step. I now feel angry towards my partner. The next step. I start my computer, not to look at porn, but to check my emails. Next step, my partner says it's time for bed. I say I'll just be a little bit longer. The next step, the beliefs come. After the day I've had today, I try to get my sexual needs met, but my partner was unwilling. I'm justified in going from my email account to something else after the day that I've had. Usually there is a build-up to a slip. And we need to actually, when that happens, go back and reanalyse what happened. And where can we intervene next time? What failed? Because you know what, I could take that lane, or that way, or go there, or go there, or go there. I could have done that. It's always easier earlier out near Wheelers Hill Secondary College than it is just before you get onto the M1. Let me tell you, it's always easier there than later on. So intervening at the consequence level is actually is doing that. It's when I've had a near miss, that's good. We probably need to go back and think what happened, what went wrong, or when I've had a slip. A, antecedents. B, beliefs. C, consequences. We need to think about how do we intervene at each of those areas because we want to live our lives that reflects the image of Christ. We want to please our loving Heavenly Father. But you know what? That's done by the Holy Spirit, but it also takes work. Put to death the acts of the sinful nature. We want to put on Christ. There's work to be done there. And that does take time. So let me just finish off my time with just some general principles and then talk about a brief plan. What might be a first steps plan? So, firstly, the general principles. Number one, cut off access wherever you can. In the old days, I'd say burn whatever you have, burn it, get rid of it. Now you might not be able to totally get rid of your phones or whatever. I appreciate that. But do whatever you can. Net nannies, leaving stuff, only looking at computers in public places, or don't take phones in the room, whatever. Cut off access wherever you can. Now people always say to me, "Oh yeah, but Grant, I know how to get around my XXX software or whatever it is." I don't care. Show me that you're serious. Do something. Because even if you can get around your software, it's going to be 2 or 3 more turns in suburbia. It's going to give you a couple more chances. So cut off access as much as possible. At least that's a starting point. Secondly, change your habits. So remember we talked about a trigger is time of day. That's a big one. Same with location. It's really important there, I'd say, to change habits. We need to do something. We need to change that up. Break the association by changing some habits somewhere. Thirdly, up there, just don't feed your fantasies. That's important. It's simple, but it's just worthwhile saying. So, like birds that kind of exist in public squares, but they return even more when we feed them, same with this, our kind of thought life works that way too. Our thoughts do come. Birds just come. They just come and land. But if you feed them, they will keep coming back more and more. What's the old saying? You can't stop a bird from landing on your head. Thoughts will come. But you can stop a bird from building a nest up there. So thoughts will come, but don't feed them. Thoughts will come. And there's some ways, some techniques to do that. Mind bouncing, calling it out loud. Saying out loud, "Grant, this is not you, this is just my brain." Something to bring it out. Be patient. Again, like Jee was saying, be patient. Resist feeling defeated. We're putting on the new self here. It doesn't happen necessarily overnight. And so it will take time. We need to keep on working. Again, that's why the A, Bs and Cs are all important there. And finally, we want to walk by the Spirit. Keep short accounts with God. 1 John 1, just such a wonderful chapter of the Bible. If we say we're without sin, we lie and the truth is in us. But if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just, and He will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness, John says. He says, "I write these things to you, not that you will sin, but that you know that we have one on our behalf who stands in as an atoning sacrifice for us." And so that's really important. Keep short accounts with God. Keep short accounts with others. We need to bring it into the light and live in the light together. So what's a simple plan just to get you going? It's called the 4X plan. 4 things related to 4s in each one of them. That's why it's the 4X plan. Number 1, I would say we want to start with 4 accountability friends. 4 friends who form like a rectangle around us. 4 friends. And we want to be honest. You know what? I want to grow in my purity life, particularly related to internet pornography. Will you stand with me and be an accountability partner with this? And people will probably go, yes? Oh, and can you do that with me too? Let's be honest, that's probably true. So we want to bring it out in the open. 4 friends. I would say 4 is important, not 1, 4. 4 people that you can contact with, because not everyone's going to be accessible at one point in time, and different people might have different strengths. 4 friends. Number 2, I want to have 4 positive reasons why I want to change this behaviour. 4 positive reasons, not negative reasons. 4 positive reasons. 4 reasons that are actually motivational, that call me forward, that's a positive vision. Not something that I could do better when I'm dead. What I mean by is this, I don't want to eat chocolate anymore. When you're dead, you'll be able to do that better than you can now. But I want to run a marathon. Well, you can't do that when you're dead. That's something that I want to push forward to for positive reasons. Why I want to change this behaviour. Positive reasons, not negative. Positive reasons to change. Revalue these things. Focus on those values. Get them in front of our mind. Write them up. Keep them ahead of us. 4 contingency plans that will last for 14 minutes. Why 14? Because it has a 4 in it. That's all. But just at least 4 things you can do when you are triggered. And those 4 things should relate to your triggers. So why only 4? Well, you probably need somewhere to start. 4 is easier than 15. But start with 4. And again, I would say you want to out-dopamine the potential negative dopamine. You want to positively stimulate in those 14 minutes by doing something that's going to be positive rather than think about the negative dopamine hit that I'll get from doing that behaviour. That's really important. For me, it's not about 100 push-ups and a cold shower. It's actually something that I can engage myself positively in more. So think of those four pictures that Jee put up before. Something to do with those things. One of my favourite ones is if I have a crave, I'll say, I'm not going to decide anything. I'll put it to the side. I'll spend 15 minutes doing something else. What will I do? I'm going to think of someone who I really care about, and I'm going to construct a plan that would just really bring a smile to their face. What would bring a smile to my spouse's face? I know she really loves being with her sister. What if I could organise a mystery outing next Saturday where I'll blindfold her and we'll end up coming into town, driving somewhere, we'll end up at a park, we'll walk for a kilometre, and then we'll find a picnic set up. And then I'll secretly text her sister, and her sister will come and join us. That will just really bring a smile to her face. Now, you think about using porn right now. It's disgusting. I don't want to do that because I'm positively engaged in something much more valuable to me. 4 contingency plans that is going to out-stimulate the stimulation. Positive, healthy, helpful. It might not be that. It might be talking to a friend. It might be praying with a friend. It might be asking, how can I pray for you? Getting out of myself. Sorry, I need to move on. So 4 things, at least 4 things, and for 4 weeks, and then we reevaluate. We're going to keep it moving. Don't get stale. Okay, so what we've covered, just trying to understand kind of a basic psychological model of action and how to intervene at each of those 3 points. That 4X plan is just a simple way to get going in something to do with that. Yeah, that's all I have to say. I think we're up to the questions time, and I'll hand over to Charles there. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll get all the speakers to come up. And we also have Pastor Sam, who's going to make sure everyone behaves, to come up on stage as well as part of the panel. Thanks. I think we all have a mic. So, yep. Well, thanks Grant and Jee for the really informative presentation. So we actually have a fair number of questions, but I don't think we'll be able to have time to go through all of them. So my apologies to those who might not have the questions answered. But first question is, this is to Jee. When we hear stories about people who recover almost instantly without relapse, almost like a cold turkey, what's happening in their brain? Is there any scientific explanation, or is it just fortunate?
I have a cognitive explanation, so we don't know the brain part yet, because it is true that you can have willpower, but if you survey those people, this is mostly anecdotal, but fairly big sample size. People who are able to go cold turkey, it's because they typically can find something else to work hard on. Yeah, something else to prioritize. So it's like the Bible verse, you cast the demons out. So, the room is swept clean, but then demon wandering around sees that room is clean and then brings like 10 other demons and reoccupy. So we can't be a blank space. We all invest, we all idolize something. We strive as Christians to idolize God, so, worship God only, but we have all these other things. So people who tend to be able to go cold turkey find something else more important that they decide to use all that dopamine on. So I do want to say that, I love your 4 strategies, but the quadruple X was a bit of a trigger for some reason, website, but I think it's not that you're flooding your brain with positive dopamine. It's more that you actually, when you get the trigger, the dopamine is already there. That's what the public doesn't know. When you get the trigger, the dopamine starts straight away because it wants to make that habitual pathway, make that highway. It's very true. So you're using that dopamine flood on something good, something constructive, motivating it, replacing that. So I think that's the cognitive evidence of how some people can go cold turkey.
So just to follow that on, given that, dopamine release requires hard work, and none of us like hard work, how does a person find encouragement to pursue these natural ways of getting dopamine through hard work when we don't like hard work?
Well, I think that's if we can resolve that, we'll solve most problems. I guess, again, it's about priorities. Like Grant said, maybe we can sit down and think about what is more important to you in the long term and trying to come up with simple ways to, start. Like when I want to please my husband, it's not like super elaborate. It's like it could be a compliment, that I plan. So you can sort of start off with things that you wouldn't usually do. So hard work is not necessarily like soul-crushing work. That has its own problems because stress is an inverse U-curve, how you optimize that. But it's more that you're putting in a bit more thought, a bit more effort, into something you don't actually usually think about. And that's why addiction can be so debilitating no matter what it is. Actually, whether it's illicit substances are very political. What we decide to be harmful is not necessarily the most harmful in the brain. For example, alcohol is actually most harmful in terms of families broken, diseases and stuff like that, of all, hard drugs or whatever. But sorry, I had a point getting there. But but addiction's harmful because that thing that you crave actually replaces everything in your life. And you don't even realize it. You don't realize you're being a crappy wife. You don't realize you're being a selfish friend. You don't realize you're being a selfish daughter. So that's why it's debilitating. That's why it's really important to shift that priority and start small to use up that dopamine so that your basal dopamine can increase.
Thanks for that. A quick question to Grant. If a person is using porn as a means of gaining control because they feel disempowered, what are healthy ways? I know you've mentioned some ways, but what are helpful ways to regain a sense of control instead of turning to porn? Practical ways.
It just depends. I just probably would need to ask a little bit more about that question. So in terms of control in our life, there's always a sliding scale of control. There's some things in our lives that we certainly do have control over. There's some things that we actually can have influence but not control. There's some things that we might be concerned about but actually have very little control. Control is a bit of a sliding scale. Often if control is often using in terms of using internet pornography related to control, it's just a way because I can control my emotions or something like that. So I would say that actually, again, the legitimacy of that control is not true, because it then tends to control me. And I would like to take a couple of steps back and just ask, sometimes using a bit of a control grid to kind of figure out, in any given situation, what do I have agency of that I am doing? So what control do I have that I'm doing? Is there anything in this situation that I could be doing more? Is this an area where I actually don't have control? And how does my faith then play into that? So I think I'd probably need to talk a little bit more about that. But just in general, usually when people talk about control, it's about, this is something in my life that I can control, similar to like an eating issue sometimes. And I suppose that's what we want to look at. We want to look at what is worthwhile having control over, as opposed to it controlling me.
Can I add to that? I think it's an illusion of control, actually, because you don't have control. Typically, people who watch porn and masturbate do have triggers, whatever it may be. So you're actually not in control. You are responding to that trigger. So it's more that, if I can get over this trigger, then you're in control. So you need to sort of reframe that cognition, that thought pattern in the head, like Grant said, that actually, no, I'm not having control by doing this. I
guess it's just learning, diverting your path away from the freeway. So, yep. Now, how can Christian parents help their children in this area? I understand you've made some really good practical ways, but I guess with children, are they the same, or are there any additional practical help or advice? I mean, all three of you can advise.
I would just say, if the person feels comfortable, I would talk about it often. So I talk about this with my children, and I don't talk about it all the time, but I want to talk about it a little bit every so often, so that it's actually in conversation. And if there's issues that come up, then I would, if they're willing for me to be one of their accountability partners, I'm happy to be. But I'd be encouraging them to have other godly accountability partners as well. Maybe it's not good for me to be one of their four, but I want to be involved. Yeah. And then we want to negotiate then what's some ways we can, as a family, promote positive change. Yeah.
Is there anything you want to add, Pastor Sam?
I think our experience is that conversation's quite a bit easier to have with your kids if you make sure that whenever they talk about sex, you actually engage with them, rather than say, I don't talk about that stuff. So, our kids started when they were 2 or 3, when they ask, where did I come from or whatever, now, you have to be careful with that, that you don't overload them, but make it such that talking about sex is natural. And our experience with our kids was when they hit this thing where, they tempted to masturbate or all of that, we were able to have the conversation. Now, sometimes it was a bit late, but they were able to say, look, I'm really struggling with this. What did you do? And so on, So I think communication with the kids is really, really important.
As a child of Asian parents, don't shame your children. Yeah. I think when your children are hurting or doing something bad, because you love them so much, you almost over-empathize, and it's so painful, and they can manifest as actually, I told you not to do that. What is wrong with you? I give you a refill, but I think that makes, so I tutored a lot of high school kids, many boys, during my Sydney undergraduate years, because the parents just wanted to know that their kids weren't doing drugs. They just wanted that someone, a conduit. But when I talk to kids, they will tell me everything, even oh, by the way, today I had a first time dealing marijuana. And I'm like, what? Like, wow, kids nowadays. I mean, like, so, and that was like, 15 years ago in this high school, North Sydney high school boys. Anyway, so, just because they're smart doesn't mean that they never get into, naughty things. But and I would secretly tell the parents, like, this happened today, but we had this conversation, I had this talk with the teachers. But the kids are so unwilling to tell parents because they'll just tell me off. They'll just yell at me. They won't listen why I did it. They're not interested in how I feel in any way. And now as a grown-up, I realize it's because the empathy is so strong. My parents also didn't know how to deal with their own emotions. But I want to urge, especially maybe it's not just an Asian thing, but shaming them will make them talk about it less and less and less. And it gets to a point that they could have been raped, they could have sexual abuse, but they can't even share with you because they're scared that they'll get into trouble first. So I think don't scold them, don't shame them, listen first, pray together and work out a solution together.
That's very good advice. How is God's heart, forgiveness, and his finished good work or good news? How is God's heart, forgiveness, and his finished work good news to all who struggle with pornography? I guess not just pornography, but addiction as a whole. I mean, how do we know someone who might have a struggle? How do we present God's good news to them in such a way that touches them, that changes their behavior?
Yeah, I think this is where we need to keep taking people to the foot of the cross, I think, and saying, you are as clean as the day when Jesus died for you. And yeah, you've slipped up. And, 1 John 1, I write to you that you might not sin. But if you do, we've got the sacrifice of atonement that cleanses us from all sin. It's wonderful truth. And it saves us from despair and depression and despondency. And I think the problem is sometimes we take that cheaply. We think, oh, well, I can do this, Jesus will forgive me. But that's not standing at the foot of the cross either. What you see when you stand at the foot of the cross is the creator of the universe suffering so you can be free. And to say to him, thanks a lot, I'm just going to go and do it again, is like saying, I don't understand what you did. Because I think if that is our mindset, that's actually what we're thinking and saying. That we don't really value what Jesus has done for us. So I think we need to keep speaking the gospel, preaching the gospel to ourselves and preaching the gospel to others. Yeah, I think, and especially people who are feeling really wicked and sinful and dirty. Yeah.
And I just think that it's a beautiful truth that, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And he gives us his Holy Spirit to empower us to live new lives. And that does have to be lived out, but that's the trajectory. And so, they're just all beautiful truths we cannot move away from.
I often share how I met Jesus and the unconditional love I felt. But the unconditional love, I say, is amazing because Jesus actually knows me through and through way better than I do. And I have lots of lame and selfish thoughts, very, very lame, very try hard and, trying to impress people and very selfish and very proud and arrogant. But if he understands all of that, and I make mistakes all the time, like actual tangible actions that lead to mistakes, that lead to hurting people. But being perfect, but he can see all that, but still empathize and die for me. I say that makes the love that much greater. Not my guilt, but his love. So I don't think about my guilt. I don't think about my shame. I just think, wow, the greater my guilt, the greater his love. That's what I share.
Yeah, I guess very often is the guilt after the action. That's one thing, but to believe that God has forgiven you is a different thing. And I think that's where people sometimes struggle with, because they never believe that God actually forgave them for what they have done. So on that topic, so how can the church or life group or a discipler be equipped to support those with porn addiction in a safe and trusted environment? I don't have the handout, so I guess you got it.
I would say, I just think we just need to talk about it more, because it goes on. It's not like this is, but then I think trying to follow a simple plan of support, like being able to be available to each other, being aware of each other's triggers and how we can support one another when we're tempted or craving, to have other people on the journey with us. I just think that's really important, to talk about it and to have some kind of a plan that we can keep revising and encouraging each other with. Yeah.
Yeah, just on your first point, as a pastor, when I hear statistics like 85% of males have accessed porn last week, when I get up to preach on a Sunday morning, I assume that 87% of the people in front of me have done that this week. Now, your religiosity graph maybe would make me less cynical.
But the last 2 years, they're showing that it didn't matter anymore. So the times are changing. Yeah, that was definitely true like 5-10 years ago. But yeah, I know, amazing, right?
And it's flipped a bit too. I think the female use of porn is
Really
amongst under 30-year-olds is really, it's almost equivalent to males, I think. Anyway, it's a year or two since I looked at it, but yeah. So anyway, I think, so that means it's got to be talked about in our life group. If, 7 out of 8 guys in the room have accessed porn in the last week, that's something that, they need support with by the poor one person who hasn't. Yeah.
Okay.
So at an individual level, I've had young men approach about, I'm feeling really depressed, I'm feeling really unmotivated, you're a mental health researcher, I often actually just one email, and then I say, maybe you can talk to Joe, our elder, or, I do sort of transfer to same-sex mentor, but I do ask about porn because it's such a symptom of using porn and masturbating so much. But at a personal level, my husband, he had to recover. Actually, when we first held hands when we were dating, I was once divorced, so before we even dated, we actually had this conversation about porn. And but when we first started dating and we held hands, his hands were so abnormally sweaty, and it's actually one of the anecdotal symptoms of porn addiction. So I confronted him straight away. Poor husband. That's why he's not here. He's supporting me online. But because we openly talk about it and we don't shame, each other, and so he's also encouraged to, when I do send the young men along his way, he sort of tries to lead them that way as well. I do think that it's such an intimate thing. I don't think that Protestant churches need like a Hail Mary booth where you confess. Because I've heard that someone said, why don't we have like a booth where you can have confessions and then that's it? And I'm like, yeah, but those confession booths actually enable the addiction, because you go and confess because you don't have to be accountable, you don't have to change, they just listen, you feel better, hopefully, but you don't Hail Mary, but then you do it again and you come back. So that fuels your addiction. So it's better that, I like that you said your accountability partner will be like 4 people. It's better to have real people that you trust or you care about that can check up on you and you can check up on each other.
Can I just say something, one more quick thing on that? I think with any sin, that is such a powerful thing, that you out yourself. That you say, I'm struggling with anger about this or that, or I'm struggling with my thought life. And to actually confess it to somebody else, in my experience, breaks about 50% of the power of it. And then you can see a pathway out. And you know that next time you see that person, if they're doing their job, they're going to say, how you going with that anger, Sam? And
Okay, one last question. This is for Grant. Would you mind, well, thanks for your talk, especially about the 4 reasons why. Would you mind sharing with us some of the positive reasons that have been helpful to either you or people you are helping?
So if a person is of faith, then I'd definitely say, relating personally with Jesus is a really important reason. Christianity is not a religion. It's actually about living, following a real person. And so there's a relational aspect of my sin. And so I really want to enjoy my fellowship with Jesus through the person of the Holy Spirit. There's stuff about being able to be a man of integrity. That's another really positive reason. Our sexuality is somewhat malleable in some different ways, and to be honest, I know that using porn makes my sexuality changed. It changes me in some way. And so I really want to actually have a healthy sex life with my life partner, my spouse. And so that is what I want to focus on. I don't want to detract from that. I want to have a healthy vision of that. There's a few, I could go on, but they're certainly for me some very positive ones that are motivational for me.
Can I ask, what about for single people though?
Yep. So I would be saying that I want to, because I'm cultivating my sexuality whether I'm married or single, and so I'm looking forward to potentially, I want to live my life like 1 Thessalonians 4 says, in an honourable way, in devotion to the Lord, because I want to please Him. So there's that relational aspect, but also the future. There's a potential future that I could have with a spouse, and I want that to be prepared for, not actually starting on the back foot. That's not to say that it's some unforgivable sin. If I've done that in the past, it'll ruin my life. I'm not trying to say that, but that's still a motivation. My sexuality is crafted, and I am preparing it for the future. Whether I'm married or single at the moment, I'm still influencing it, preparing it.
Well, let's put our hands together for our 3 speakers. Thank you. All right, so thank you. And if we can move on to the next slide. So our next seminar is engaging in social media on the 8th of August 2021 at 1:30 Sunday. And our speaker is Pastor Murray Campbell. So please be there, and we'll have just as interesting discussions as we have today. And then we move on to the next slide. Here is some information about mental health support. You can access all that on the resource button on our church website. And if you don't mind, for those who are here and online, if you can go on to our next slide, which is our feedback about today. We would love to hear, where's the next slide? Is there another slide on the feedback form? Yeah. Here's a QR code. You can give us some feedback. We always love to know whether we're doing the right thing or we're on track. But thank you for everyone who's come in today, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you so much.